Welcome to our Centricity Practice Solution and EMR overview of ICD-10 webinar. This is the first in our series of ICD-10 preparedness webinars. We are excited to have you join us here on our ICD-10 adventure. We have had an overwhelming response to this webinar series, and we wanted to thank you for your patience as we transition webinar hosting platforms to support the volume. Please note all sessions will be recorded and posted to the GE Healthcare Engage website. Some logistics during this webinar: please use the Q&A feature to ask questions. We will answer as many of these questions as possible at the end of the session. Now, without further ado, I would like to introduce Rhea Davis, our education consultant and certified coder, for an overview of ICD-10.
Thanks so much, Hillary. Again, my name is Rhea Davis, and I am a member of the Ambulatory Practice Solution education team and part of the core ICD-10 readiness team here at GE. And I have been here for a little over 4 years now in 2 different capacities, but have worked with Centricity since 2004. And prior to that, I traveled and taught coding courses all over the country, and wherever I went, I really tried to make it my mission to make coding interesting and to make it something that people can really understand. So with the great turnout for this session, my plan to turn everybody into coders is coming together nicely. So we have over 1,000 people on the call today to kick off this ICD-10 series. So to echo what Hillary just said, thank you for understanding and accepting my second calendar invitation so that we could host this on a larger platform. We just wanted to make sure that everyone was able to attend this live session for the opportunity really just to ask some questions. But please look for another email from me later this afternoon if you are registered for tomorrow or Monday's session, as I am again going to just transfer your registration to this larger capacity WebEx platform. I've also received some emails regarding the other session in the series and how to register. And now that we understand the registration numbers, we will be hosting everything on this larger platform, so we won't have to go through that again. So your registration will be open this afternoon on our Engage site. I have popped that address back up on the screen for you. Okay, so regarding the series, we have been working with an amazing team of experts, both internal to GE as well as external organizations, to get this series together to ensure that we bring a wide variety of information to you, not just focused on the product, but the real life things that you're facing in your practice. So we are here to support you, and we are fully committed to making the transition to ICD-10 as smooth as possible. And if you were on this State of the Union call on Monday, my boss, FX, introduced our ICD-10 initiative, and he conducted a poll while he was speaking. And the results are in. It looks like a few people are 100% completely and totally prepared. But for the rest of us, we've got some work to do. Today's session is what I really wanted everyone to attend, to get us all on the same page. It is my #1 goal to make sure that everyone has baseline information and everyone can move forward in our series with the same type of information. So some of the things that we might discuss today, for those of you who have been around for a long time, or if you are a coder, might be a little bit basic, but it really just gives everybody that baseline information, and then allows us, as we move forward in our series, to dig in deeper, and that we all have the same knowledge for all of the tasks that really have to take place for this transition to happen smoothly. So again, that we are just all working with the same general knowledge. Like I've mentioned, I have been monitoring the registrations coming in, and I am seeing such a wide variety of job titles, many of which may not have general knowledge about coding. And when I saw that, I figured we should start at the beginning with all the different types of codes that we can see. Some of you may know these terms already, but bear with me. We'll tie it all in, and we will get to the good stuff about ICD-10 soon. So for those of you who are not coders, welcome to our world. Let's start with codes that are actually worth money, CPT codes. CPT stands for Current Procedural Terminology, procedural being the key word there. It's what the provider actually did for the patient during an encounter. CPT codes are worth money and are organized in a way that's pretty easy to remember. CPT codes start with the top of the body and work their way down to the toes, and also from outside the body to inside. An example of this is procedures done on the skin. Those start with a 1, while labs start with the number 8. So outside the body to inside the body. These codes are always 5 digits and are numeric. You may see some temporary codes from time to time, which start with an F or a T, but you don't see those very often. Some codes, particularly procedures, will include a pre-op, intraoperative, and postoperative period, all included in one code. You'll hear that referenced as a global period. Global periods are either 10 days for minor procedures or 90 days for major procedures. This is why modifiers are often applied to codes, to let the insurance company know that the services billed for shouldn't be included in that global payment. There are many reasons to apply modifiers, but typically in the EMR, we only see those that allow for payment of the E&M service along with a procedure. Speaking of centricity, in the EMR, these codes are typically considered services, but could also be a test or procedure. In PM, you will see every type of code, and all charge rates are set up in PM, not EMR. CPT codes are maintained by the American Medical Association and are updated yearly. Moving to another type of code that is worth money, HCPCS codes. These codes, unlike CPT, are generally for tangible items such as drugs, wheelchairs, crutches, DME supplies like casting materials for fractures, things of that nature. The Center for Medicare and Medicaid Services are responsible for publishing and maintaining these codes, which are also 5 digits long but are alphanumeric. So beyond just tangible items like these J codes for injectable drugs, CMS throws in a few of their own codes to identify services that aren't accurately defined in the CPT book, such as Pap smears for women. So in centricity on the EMR side, we will typically see these also as services. Now on to SNOMED codes. These are pretty new to our coding vernacular, although SNOMED codes have been around for several years. These codes are not worth money, meaning that there are no reimbursement rates associated to them like we would find for CPT and HCPCS codes. However, these codes are a requirement, as you've probably noticed so far, of Meaningful Use Stage 2. These 9-digit codes more clearly define what's going on with a patient and allows different systems to more accurately talk to one another. There are some MU requirements that rely heavily on SNOMED codes. So if you have any custom content, you really have to be careful and read through all of the measure requirements as they relate to these SNOMED codes. The next code is called LOINC, and the first time I saw this, I said, what the heck is a LOINC? But LOINC codes are not worth money, but they are definitely necessary for meaningful use. LOINC codes are 6 digits long, and they are essentially like a universal observation term. In centricity, we normally see them in the data mapping area of administration. And again, if you are heavily involved with MU right now, you have likely seen these codes a lot lately. Okay, so on to the real reason you're here, diagnosis codes, specifically ICD-10 codes. So just a few slides ago, I talked about codes that were worth money, specifically CPT and HCPCS codes. Well, those codes are only reimbursed from an insurance company if you have the appropriate diagnosis code. ICD-9 and ICD-10 codes identify why the patient had the service, which was submitted utilizing the procedure code. Insurance companies utilize these diagnosis codes to determine something called medical necessity. An example would be getting paid for a colonoscopy. The diagnosis code for unspecified abdominal pain will actually not pay for a colonoscopy. But if we got a little more specific and submitted the code for right lower quadrant abdominal pain, our claim would get paid. So it becomes really important to understand what codes should be used based on the patient's problem and what codes need to be used based on the payer rules. Diagnosis codes don't always identify a problem though. I just mentioned these codes identify why the patient had a service, and that's sometimes for things like a physical or a well visit. These well codes are also identified with an ICD-9 or an ICD-10 code. Another example of this would be pregnancy. There's no problem with the patient, but they're receiving medical care due to the pregnancy, so that diagnosis code accompanies the appropriate procedure code for payment. Focusing on ICD-10 and what it actually is, I have a little funny story for you. And if you were at Centricity Live in my session, sorry that you're hearing this again, but I only have a few interesting stories as it relates to ICD-10. But at the end of the day, my husband and I chat about our days during dinner. And for the past several months, I've been talking about this thing called ICD-10. And he finally asked me the other day if ICD was a word, which I thought was pretty funny. But no, ICD-10 stands for the International Statistical Classification of Diseases and Related Health Problems and is the 10th revision. And for the purposes of this call, we are also focused on the CM, or the Clinical Modification version. Now, ICD-10 isn't new. It has been around since the early 90s, and the threat of this transition here in the United States has been around since about that time. ICD-10's mission is simple: be more granular about the condition the patient has. And in order to be more granular, there are simply more codes, a lot more codes. But speaking of Centricity Live, we had a really wonderful keynote speaker who was a physician, and he mentioned ICD-10 during his speech. He was talking about ways that the body can fail and how we treat our patients. And there was a little humorous part of his inspirational speech where he said that there are at least 60,000 ways the body can fail you, and he knows that because he counted the codes in the ICD-10 book. And he went on to say that for the record, we treat shark bites and dolphin bites the same way, whether it's the initial or subsequent time a patient is being seen. So for the coders on the phone, you get that joke. And for those who are not, at the end of this session, you'll see the humor in that. When we look at ICD-9 and ICD-10, it's pretty much the same conceptually. So it's the same, only different, right? But we see ICD-9 here on the left-hand side of the screen and ICD-10 on the right. The coding concepts of grouping similar conditions together hasn't changed from one book to the next. Now we just need to learn some of the new things and new ways of grouping so that we can recognize an issue just by looking at the prefix of a code, which is an ability that most of us have today with ICD-9. Both the ICD-9 and ICD-10 books are broken into chapters with blocks of codes associated to specific problems. So for ICD-10, as an example, if you were looking for the code for diabetes, we know it would have to start with the letter E because it's an endocrine system disorder, all of which are found in this block of codes starting with E. One of the things that Centricity has been preparing customers for to date is this new code recognition. Since CPS 11 and EMR 9.8 came around, we've been showing some general code mappings to customers as they select ICD-9 codes. As time goes on, recognition of codes and categories becomes pretty simple. So you may not know the exact code for an issue, but if someone said the code is K29.01, you would at least know the person is referring to the digestive system. In terms of the code structure, on the left we have the ICD-9 layout, and on the right we have ICD-10. You'll always know that you're looking at a diagnosis code if you keep this mnemonic in mind. I see a decimal. I know that sounds kind of silly, but it will help you remember. While both ICD-9 and ICD-10 codes differ in layout, they both contain those decimal points, which is really what differentiates these codes from other codes that might have the same number of digits. So let's first take a look at ICD-9 codes. With the exception of what we call emergency codes and those well visits, the first digit will always be numeric. ICD-9 codes are 3 to 5 digits in length, with the decimal always after the first 3 digits, which identifies the category. The last 2 identify either a manifestation or the anatomic site. I mentioned just a moment ago about unspecified abdominal pain versus right lower quadrant abdominal pain. The codes, as you see here on the screen, are very similar. They just vary in the spot for the anatomic location of the pain. ICD-9 codes, as they stand, are actually pretty detailed. The biggest problem with staying with ICD-9 is really just space. As new diseases are discovered or manifestations of existing listed problems evolve, there's really nowhere to go. ICD-10 solves this issue. Now in taking a look at the ICD-10 layout on the right side of your screen, you can see it's actually, from a structural standpoint, not too different looking from ICD-9. But to recognize an ICD-10 code, the first digit here will always be an alpha character followed by 2 digits. This first sequence, just like ICD-9, identifies the category. I have an example up on the screen right now, and we're going to stick with the abdominal pain example. The next area, also like the ICD-9 codes, identifies the manifestation or anatomic site. Notice though that there is one extra space for another digit. Lastly, we see the biggest structural difference between 9 and 10, and that's the extension. Okay, so let's chat a little more about code structure and then we'll get into the rules about that extension that I just mentioned. ICD-10 codes can be 3, 4, 5, 6, or 7 digits in length. And the example that we just looked at, abdominal pain, the full code was only 5 characters. There was no need for any additional numbers or identifiers. On the screen, you are looking at the actual ICD-10 book, and I am an old school coder and keep my book by my side at all times. So throughout today's presentation, we'll be taking a look and glimpses back and forth at the book and then at centricity. The book I like to use because it is super easy to follow and will help everyone further their understanding of codes and their structure. And it will also help you in learning and understanding future functionality and concepts in centricity, which are really exciting and coming in the near future. Some of you may have already seen some glimpses of what we have in store, and I think it's going to be really great. Anyway, back to this. So R10 here is the category. It's justified to the left and just says abdominal and pelvic pain. I call this the parent code. Everything about the manifestation and anatomic site with this category will be listed below and justified just a little further to the right. So we know that any code starting with R10 is some type of abdominal or pelvic pain. But R10 on its own is not a valid code. It does require a 4th digit. Look, it says so right here. So R10.0 and R10.2 are valid codes. There's nothing next to them identifying that it says that any further information about the manifestation or anatomic site is needed. But now let's take a look at R10.3, which identifies pain localized to parts of the lower abdomen. R10.3 is also 4 characters, but with the new laterality rules in ICD-10, there is an indicator for a 5th digit to further identify the location. So in this case, R10.31 identifies right lower quadrant pain. Because that's 5 digits, it is an acceptable code and is the highest level of specificity in this category. This example is just like ICD-9. And when we compare this to centricity, it's important to understand these concepts because codes that do require additional digits are available for selection and can go up from the chart to the billing module without any issue, which would just leave a mess for the billing department to clean up. So as we see here in the problem search, there's no identifier saying that R10 requires at least 4 digits, which is why it's super important to understand general coding concepts and structure. Identifying when a code is inappropriate or requires more information becomes much easier with this type of general coding knowledge. This is not only related to ICD-10. All codes are available when searching for ICD-9 as well, but understanding concepts of the coding will help you in assisting your clinicians, or if you're a clinician, understanding when to pick a particular problem. In upcoming knowledge base updates, however, we will see the non-billable codes go away, so look for that coming soon. But for now, we still have to know how centricity displays codes to you, and we have to apply that knowledge in order to select appropriately when utilizing the full reference list. Now on to an example of what's new. This is what we don't see in 9 but will in 10, which is the code extension. And this is an area that is causing the most confusion, particularly for specialties where this applies a lot. So let's take a first look here at what the issue actually is. Remember, the benefit of moving to ICD-10 is that the format allows for future code growth and also gets a lot more granular. So in that effort, there are some cases where placeholders exist. We see that when an extension is required, but the code length isn't 7 digits long. Code extensions will always be in the 7th digit. So in this example, the category is complications specific to multiple gestation and pregnancy. It requires a minimum of 4 digits. And that's that parent code. So check out everything in this category below. And as we saw earlier, this is also indented. This is where we can pick up at least that required 4th digit. So let's move on down to 031.0. We see it requires at least 5 digits to identify the trimester of pregnancy. So if the patient is in their 2nd trimester, the code is 031.02. But wait just a second, it says it requires a 7th digit. The 7th digit extension for all codes in this category is identified in the red box above. So if we have an issue with fetus number 2 during the 2nd trimester, our code must be 031.02X2. Sort of confusing, right? If you see an X in a code, that is simply a placeholder. This is a totally new concept for ICD-10. But always keep in mind this structure. The extension, again, must always be the 7th digit, even if the code doesn't have enough numbers to get us there. So far, you might be thinking, well, that doesn't really look that bad, but we are just scratching the surface. ICD-10 is for sure changing the way that providers document. And as you've seen a glimpse so far, the way codes are conceptualized, how we select codes, how they're maintained, and then all of that has to apply to real life scenarios and our workflows for the patients that we see, and then how we document them in Centricity. On top of the changes that we see in Centricity and with documentation, ICD-10 is introducing about 56,000 new codes. 56,000! So that's about 5 times as many codes as we are all used to seeing. And there are about 14,000 ICD-9 codes and about 70,000 ICD-10 codes that we focus on that CM version. And that, my friends, is of course a huge deal. So additionally, there are some new concepts, some of which we saw already, but there are other changes such as laterality, type of healing, such as malunions, the trimester of pregnancy, initial and subsequent visits, and we have never had to face this before. Another thing that we have to remember is that our clinicians and coders are giving up some serious comfort with codes that we have been using since we've likely started in medicine. So let's take a look at some of the super important codes that are in the ICD-10 book. In addition to diseases, problems, and manifestations, the ICD-10 book includes situational codes for how things happened. And this is not a new concept. It was around in ICD-9 too, but they do seem to have gotten a little more interesting. So while there are indeed some fascinating codes in the ICD-10 book, let's take a look at the breakdown of codes. We will see the majority of our new codes in the musculoskeletal system. So if you are ortho or podiatry, sports medicine, you guys are lucky, right? You guys are going to be feeling the most pain with this transition because you have the largest change and are seeing about 50% of the entire book dedicated to your specialties. Let's take a look at a great example of code expansion in the musculoskeletal section, an open fracture of the femoral shaft. In ICD-9, there are a total of 16 codes that can describe this injury. In ICD-10, there are over 1,500 codes to describe the same injury. Now, the codes are just incredibly specific as to describing different types of breaks to the femur as well as laterality. So think about this in terms of not only having the provider select a code, but just how specific they have to be also in their documentation. All right, time for a little break and time for a fun fact. Most countries already use some version of ICD-10 and really have for some time. The US is one of the last places in the world to actually adopt ICD-10. The originally scheduled adoption date was October 1st, 2014, but was pushed back to October 1st, 2015. And October may seem like a weird time to start, but every year, October 1st has been the date to start using the next year's codes, even with ICD-9. So in the coding world, October 1st is completely logical. Another neat fact about ICD-10 is that with worldwide adoption, while there are some differences amongst book versioning around the world, each country utilizes the same platform and structure. So no matter where you are in the world, regardless of the native language, codes all map the same way. Conditions such as hypertension will all translate to the heading I-10, which is really pretty cool. To help ease the pain of the transition, there is a concept called mapping, and you may hear it called GEMS mapping, which stands for General Equivalence Mappings. And these are provided by CMS and is what GE utilizes currently in Centricity when a user selects an ICD-9 code, as we'll see in the next few examples. Let's first take a look at a one-to-one match, and we'll take good old abdominal pain, which is what we've been using. It is a one-to-one match, so there's no issues there. In Centricity, it maps perfectly. But in terms of other mappings, as you might have guessed, there is typically not a one-to-one match from ICD-9 to ICD-10, and this is what causes a big issue for our customers as it stands today in our ICD-10 compliant versions of Centricity. We often map to something that's pretty close just to give the user an idea of the category the code will be in after the transition. The mapping is very difficult, though, to get to the highest level of specificity. Taking a look at the closed fracture of two ribs in ICD-9, there is one possible code. However, in ICD-10, take a look at the available manifestation digits. Remember, those are the codes right after the decimal point, and they vary by laterality. So here we see right, left, bilateral, or unspecified. In Centricity, it maps to the unspecified side, which at this point seems appropriate. However, this is an injury code, which should get us thinking about that pesky extension since it applies to most injury codes. So what we see in Centricity isn't a final billable code. Understanding this coding concept right off the bat is key to coding successfully in Centricity as it functions today. Centricity does have the ICD-10 code available, we just have to search for it differently and specifically for ICD-10 codes to ensure the most appropriate one is selected. But to ease your mind, when you're ready to code strictly in ICD-10, the mapping methodology works much better. In ICD-9, the likelihood of a one-to-many match is pretty great due to the new concepts of things like laterality and those extensions. When we reverse the mappings and go from ICD-10 to ICD-9, we are far more accurate simply because there's more likelihood of a one-to-one match. So this is reflected in the EMR and also in the practice management system. One coding concept to point out is the consistency in identifying sides. In the area for the anatomic site, that's that area after the decimal point, regardless of how many digits the code has, the right side of the body is identified with a 1, and the left side is identified with the number 2. If bilateral is appropriate, it is identified with the number 3. And much like the ICD-9 book, codes ending with 00 or the number 9 are typically considered unspecified. So taking a peek inside the ICD-10 book again, we see that the book is broken actually into two sections, the index and the tabular area. The index is where we would look up a code alphabetically. So when coding, you would think of the main keyword of a diagnosis and then look to find that word. Manifestations would then be under our keyword. So for example, if I was searching for the code for a broken right arm, the code would not be under arm. Clearly, it wouldn't be under the word broken either. It's just not that casual. So it would be listed under the word fracture. So here I would go and flip until I found fracture. So if it was a fracture of the radius and you looked to the forearm, it would then direct you to look at the radius. So then we go to radius and follow the index until we see the code area to review in the tabular area of the book. When you open the tabular area, we see the exact code that we're looking for, the laterality, and then also the required 7th digit. So how about we just pop open Centricity and take a look at it there instead of just here on the slides. Bear with me one moment. Just pulling up Centricity. Okay, there we go. I am currently in the chart module of CPS in an active update with the problem search window open. And I can search for codes several ways, but right now I am going to do the full reference list. So from a user perspective, this is just like opening up the front of our coding book and taking a look at the index. When searching for forearm fracture when looking at all ICD-9 codes, we get a pretty short list of options returned. Some are mapped to an ICD-10 code with the full 7 digits, and some are not. S52.90, just so you know, is unspecified forearm fracture. Let's see just how specific that we can get, though, when searching for ICD-10 codes. Okay, with my code type in the search set to ICD-10, forearm fracture turns up at least 120 codes compared to the 6 when looking at ICD-9. In Centricity, if more than 60 results are available based on your search term, the results return with chapters, and we were introduced to chapters earlier in this session, so hopefully that makes sense at this point. When we read the descriptions, though, and see the code range, it should be clear that we're looking at an injury and not a disease of the musculoskeletal system. And this is a common question that I get. How do I know what to choose? But if we stop and read the options, it should be pretty clear in which chapter we will find our code. If this is an issue in your practice, there are other ways to manage and search for codes, and during this transition it would be a really good time to explore things like the problem custom list, the smart search, and potentially even problems CCC. But moving on, as we continue to click into the folders, we will go from the chapter heading to the blocks of codes, and we keep double clicking until we get to the main category, which, as you can see, there are now a ton of results that come back for forearm fracture. So perhaps by searching a different way, results will return in a more clear way for the user. It's all about understanding coding conventions and the layout to ease the pain of searching here in Centricity. Before we scroll down and take a look at all of the results, let's stop for a second and take a look at these first 3 codes. Do you see what I see? I see that the first 3 returned results as the category, which likely requires at least a 5th digit, because right under this main code, I see the same code with an additional digit, which is also likely not a code, because right under that there is a code that's the same with 1 additional digit. Plus, when I'm reading the descriptions, I don't see key items that I'd be looking for, such as laterality and the type of encounter. Not until I see a code with the 7th digit extension should I actually think about selecting that code. I'm going to pop up the same area in the book right now for comparison. Now, as we scroll through this area, especially when looking at ICD-10 codes, you're likely thinking already that this isn't the best option for your practice when transitioning to ICD-10. And you know what? I would agree with you. Utilizing the reference list to find codes that you need, especially those you use frequently, should be a last resort as the product stands today. In the relatively near future, though, this search will become much more intuitive in assisting the provider in drilling down to the highest level of specificity. So as a coder, it makes me really happy to see this, because I know this stuff isn't for everyone. The concepts are hard, and when seeing patients, we want to choose quickly but accurately and move on. So we have to think differently today. How can we alter our workflow so that we put codes in front of our providers that are to the highest level of specificity, have descriptions that make sense to them, and also look great for the documentation our patients are now getting? But in order to develop great workflows and set up ideas for your practice, ultimately it comes back to understanding, in general, these coding concepts so that we can put that workflow into place in an effective way with a solution that will work best for our practices. Okay, back to the slide deck. We're going to take a look at a few more conceptual coding changes which could also impact documentation, not just necessarily code selection. The first one we'll take a look at is tobacco abuse and addiction. There are 20 codes in ICD-10 that break down this problem by dependence. So dependence on what type of tobacco. The code also requires the provider to state if this dependence is uncomplicated, in remission, or if the patient is in withdrawal. Now, this particular example is a huge departure from what providers code today. So if this is something that is used frequently in your practice, things that we have to think about: how can we utilize Centricity to help guide our providers in, first of all, notating this level of detail, and secondly, selecting the right code. So perhaps we utilize custom content to capture this, or we can utilize things like a problem custom list specifically for these types of codes. And upon utilizing the codes, we do again have to make sure that this is very clear. Ensure that the provider has read through the documentation to ensure that the documentation reflects just how specific these codes are getting. Now, when I talk about good documentation, it does not have to be lengthy. It just has to tell the complete story. And this can happen in our subjective or objective areas of the note. So take this HPI, for example. A patient comes in with the chief complaint that her left knee is hurting. The provider got the story from the patient. When did it happen? How did it happen? How does it feel? If I was trying to pass a coding test, I would use all 4 of these codes. But in real life, your provider is probably only going to utilize the left knee strain, which might be okay for your payer. They may not require all of the extras. But what happens if Sally sued the city for having a hole in the sidewalk? Does the insurance claim need those additional codes on how and why the injury occurred? So just beyond general code selection and concepts, we have to think one step further, even outside of our general setup in Centricity. We have to think about the audience. Who sees these codes besides just being in the EMR and our practice management system? Let's take a look now at another big change, coding for pregnancy. On the left, we see that in the ICD-9 world, we had 3 code options. In ICD-10, it's now broken down by trimester. So thinking about how the provider documents, what OBS terms can we have them refer to? Is there something in a workflow that we can do as our site administrators that can help the provider remember what trimester the patient is in and if this is her first pregnancy or not? So think of the forms that we have available, especially in your own workflows. Where can we place them to make the code selection easier for the provider? Can we assist with perhaps putting on a form this information and putting it into favorites simply as a reference? So let's use what we know we have. We've got the EDC, para and gravid obs terms. Our providers are filling this information out. So assist them in referencing it as it relates to the appropriate code selection. When it comes to complications during pregnancy, 2 codes are needed. One that describe the condition and another narrowing in on the exact week of gestation. This concept is a hard one to communicate to your providers, as currently Centricity isn't guiding you to select that secondary code. However, most complications with pregnancy will require this secondary code, so that concept should be easy enough to remember. If your providers need some assistance, ACOG has a great training tutorial for your providers to reference. But when we apply this to Centricity, how long should that second code for the weeks of gestation stay on a patient's problem list? And here's where our super users come in as the expert. Set up your system to take advantage of the duration when selecting the problem. Or better yet, build a custom list with the duration that defaults to 1 day, so the problem automatically comes off the patient's active problem list, and our providers aren't going back and cleaning this type of information up. In some cases, there are codes that are the same but have very different meanings from ICD-9 to ICD-10. Remember that in ICD-9 coding, there are some codes that start with E and others that start with V. Because ICD-10 is always alpha first, this is bound to be an issue, but it all goes back to the chapters and code concepts. In ICD-9, Codes that start with the letter E are what I call emergency codes. They explain external causes. So those are where those funny ICD-9 codes come in, like those water skis that are on fire. V codes in ICD-9 are typically preventive codes. These are codes that don't describe a problem, such as the codes describing supervision of a normal pregnancy that we just saw. V codes also describe family histories and also if a patient came in with a potential health hazard. Remember this chart? In ICD-10, codes that start with E are for endocrine system disorders, while V codes in ICD-10 are those external causes. So a V code is where you would find those flaming water skis. So while codes themselves might be the same, the descriptions are vastly different. Remembering the concepts when reviewing the description of the code will allow you to easily differentiate them at a glance. And remember too that in Centricity, codes are labeled as ICD-9 or ICD-10. Okay, so that wraps up our initial session, which was, like I said at the beginning, intended to just be an overview, an introduction to ICD-10, and also with a little peek of how it translates to Centricity. So if you take a look at the coming sessions, we will be doing some deep dives into Centricity setup and general workflow best practices. But at this point, you will at least be armed with some good baseline information about ICD-10. Tomorrow's session is focused on showing you how to navigate our new customer portal, and Amy Sebesta will give us a run through, and then I will be back to walk you through a great tool that we have developed, which is a workbook containing not just the task items that you should be doing to prepare for this transition, but is also filled with tools to assist you in notating and tracking your key decisions, performing tasks like auditing and preloading. So I hope that you can join me for that tomorrow at the same time. But I hope you found this session to be helpful. It looks like we do have some time to have Hillary come back on the line as she has been collecting your questions from the Q&A area. Hillary? We did have a small recording problem on the line when the Q&A started. However, the following questions were asked and answered. The first question was, will we be able to print out the presentation? Well, since you have just watched this presentation, you can likely tell there is a lot of animation within it, which would not make for a good printout. We will, however, post an alternative presentation that will have much of the same information. The next question was if the webinars would be recorded. Yes, every webinar will be recorded and subsequently posted to the portal. If we experience any technical recording problems, we will recreate the session as we are doing here. Next, regarding the specifics for Centricity, what courses should we sign up for? The best practice and setup sessions are scheduled for later in May and the start of June, so please check the Engage website to ensure you select the appropriate session based on your product. The last question was, I see a preload workflow on the Engage site. Can I download that now and start using the form? And the answer is yes, of course you can, but please read through the instructions and determine if it will work for your practice. Make any tweaks as necessary for your group. And that was the end of Q&A. So thank you for your time in watching this on-demand session.